Close your eyes for a moment and consider a simple question. Who are you really? Not your name, not your job, not your memories, not the story you tell yourself in quiet moments, but the deeper presence that seems to be. You, behind your thoughts, behind your feelings, behind your decisions. It feels solid, it feels continuous, it feels unquestionably real. And yet, what if this sense of being someone is not something you possess, but something your brain is actively generating right now? In this very second, as an act of biological storytelling. Every sight you see, every sound you hear, every emotion you feel, and every certainty you hold about yourself is not a direct window onto the world. It is a construction. Your brain is constantly predicting what is out there and who you are, weaving sensations, memories, and expectations into a seamless inner movie that feels like reality itself. You do not simply experience the world. Your brain manufactures the experience of the world, and within that same process, it manufactures you. It's to say that consciousness is not something we possess, but something the brain actively creates is to challenge one of the most deeply rooted intuitions we have about our own existence. Most people grow up believing that consciousness is a kind of inner light that simply is there. An invisible but permanent core that accompanies us throughout life. It feels as if awareness sits behind our eyes like a silent witness, observing the world as it unfolds. Yet modern neuroscience paints a very different picture. Consciousness is not a static substance or a mysterious add onto the body. It is an ongoing biological activity, continuously generated by neural processes that are working to keep us alive in an uncertain and changing environment. Every moment you are awake, your brain is performing an extraordinary act of construction. It is taking streams of electrical signals from your senses, combining them with memories, expectations, emotions, and internal bodily states, and assembling them into a unified experience that feels like a coherent reality. The colors you see, the sounds you hear, the feeling of sitting in a chair, the sense that time is passing, and even the thought that you are not simply detected, they are actively produced. If the brain were to stop this work, even briefly, your conscious world would vanish, not gradually, but completely. This becomes evident when we look at what happens during sleep, anesthesia, or certain types of brain injury. In deep, dreamless sleep, the world does not fade gently into darkness as if you were closing your eyes on a still present consciousness. It disappears entirely. There is no sense of time passing, no awareness waiting in the background. Hours can go by, yet from your perspective, nothing at all has happened. Consciousness switches off because the brain has stopped generating the patterns that sustain it. When those patterns restart, experience returns fully formed as if it had never been absent. This on-off quality reveals that consciousness is not a constant essence, but a state that depends on specific neural activity being in place. The same principle appears in anesthesia. When the anesthetic takes effect, you do not drift into some dim, private mental chamber where awareness continues in secret. You simply vanish from your own perspective. There is no inner observer lingering in the shadows. When you wake up, it feels instantaneous, even though hours may have passed. This abrupt disappearance and reappearance strongly suggests that consciousness is not something you carry with you like a soul in a backpack. It is something that your brain must actively produce moment by moment, or it does not exist at all. Neuroscience also shows that the specific contents of consciousness can be altered by directly changing brain activity. Stimulation of certain brain regions can evoke sensations of touch, flashes of light, emotional surges, or even the feeling of a presence in the room when no one is there. Damage to other areas can selectively remove parts of conscious experience. The ability to recognize faces, to perceive motion, or to feel ownership over one's own limbs. These are not changes to a hidden mental theater that sits separate from the brain. They are changes to the very fabric of experience itself. This means that what you are aware of, and even how you feel yourself to exist, is inseparable from what your neurons are doing. Understanding consciousness as something the brain creates also helps explain why it feels so convincingly real and stable. The brain is not merely reacting to the world as it comes in. It is constantly predicting what is likely to happen next. It uses past experience to anticipate sensory input and then updates those predictions based on what actually arrives. Your conscious experience is the brain's best current model of what is out there and what kind of organism you are within it. Because these predictions are usually very accurate, the constructed nature of experience is hidden. The world feels direct and self-evident, even though it is actually a carefully maintained simulation shaped by biology. This predictive construction is not limited to the external world. Your sense of being a self, the feeling that you are a single, unified entity with a continuous identity, is also something your brain is actively generating. Signals from your heart, lungs, muscles, and internal organs are constantly being monitored and integrated into a feeling of bodily presence. At the same time, memories, emotions, and goals are woven into a narrative that feels like a personal story. Together, these processes create the impression of an inner me, who exists independently of the brain's activity, even though that impression is itself a product of that very activity. Seeing consciousness in this way has profound implications. It means that changes in brain chemistry, development, injury, or disease can reshape not just what we think, but who we feel ourselves to be. Depression, anxiety, psychosis, and neurodegenerative disorders do not merely affect a person who exists separately from their brain. They alter the biological process that is actively generating that person's experience of being alive. This reframes mental health conditions not as personal failings, but as disruptions in the mechanisms that create consciousness itself. It also invites a more compassionate view of human behavior. If consciousness and the self are constructions generated by neural systems that evolve to keep us alive, then our thoughts, fears, impulses, and biases are not purely moral choices arising from a free, floating inner agent. They are shaped by biological machinery that is constantly balancing prediction, survival, and adaptation. This does not eliminate responsibility, but it grounds it in an understanding of how deeply our inner lives are rooted in physical processes. Perhaps most strikingly, recognizing that consciousness is something the brain does rather than something the brain has reveals how fragile and precious it really is. The vivid inner world you inhabit, your memories, your dreams, your sense of meaning, your feeling of being someone, is the result of a delicate orchestration of neural activity that can be disrupted, altered, or silenced entirely. There is no hidden vault where you are stored safely beyond the reach of biology. What exists is a living process unfolding right now, keeping your personal universe alive from one moment to the next. The idea that the sense of self is a biological construction rather than a fixed entity challenges one of the most deeply held assumptions people have about their own existence. From early childhood, we grew up feeling that there is a solid me at the center of experience, a stable presence that persists through time and anchors every thought, memory, emotion, and decision. It feels as if this self is something we discover rather than something that is being made. Yet neuroscience and psychology increasingly suggest that this feeling of being a single, continuous individual is not a given. It is something the brain actively assembles from many moving parts, and it is constantly being updated to suit the demands of survival, learning, and social life. Your brain is always receiving signals from your body. Your heartbeat, your breathing, the tension in your muscles, the temperature of your skin, and the chemical state of your blood are all being monitored and regulated in the background. These internal signals are not merely maintenance data. They are used to generate the feeling that you inhabit a body and that this body belongs to you. The simple sense of being located somewhere, of occupying a physical space, and of having boundaries between yourself and the world emerges from this ongoing integration. When these processes are disrupted, as in certain neurological conditions, people can feel detached from their bodies, experience their limbs as foreign, or even believe that parts of their body are not really theirs. These strange experiences reveal that bodily ownership is not automatic. It is constructed. At the same time, the brain is weaving together memories, emotions, goals, and social information into a narrative that feels like a personal story. You do not experience your life as a random collection of moments. You experience it as something that belongs to a particular individual with a history and a direction. This narrative self gives you the feeling that there is a continuous me who was there yesterday, who is here today, and who will still be here tomorrow. Yet memory itself is not a perfect recording of the past. Each time you remember something, your brain reconstructs it, blending what actually happened with what you now believe, feel, and expect. Over time, your personal story subtly changes, even though it feels stable. This means that the self you feel you are is not only constructed, but also constantly rewritten. Social interaction plays a powerful role in shaping this construction. From infancy, your brain learns who you are by reflecting how others respond to you. Your name, your personality traits, your perceived strengths and weaknesses, and your social roles are reinforced by the reactions of family, friends, teachers, and society at large. Over time, these external signals become internal beliefs about who you are. You may come to see yourself as confident, shy, creative, responsible, difficult, or kind, not because these traits are etched permanently into your biology, but because your brain has learned to model itself in ways that fit your social environment. This learned self-model then guides how you think, feel, and act, further reinforcing the identity you believe to be you. Even the feeling that you are the author of your own actions is part of this biological construction. Your brain prepares and initiates movements before you become consciously aware of deciding to move. The conscious sense of "I chose to do this" arises slightly after the underlying neural processes are already underway. This does not mean that you have no agency, but it does mean that the feeling of being a central controller is a story your brain tells to make sense of what it is already doing. The self you experience is therefore not a command center issuing orders, but a model your brain creates to keep behavior organized, predictable, and socially understandable. The constructed nature of the self becomes even clearer when it changes. Major life events, trauma, illness, or neurological injury can reshape personality, emotional patterns, and even moral judgment. People sometimes say that someone is not the same person anymore after a brain injury, a stroke, or the onset of dementia. This is not just a poetic way of speaking. When the neural processes that sustain memory, emotion, and self-modeling are altered, the person's experience of being themselves can change profoundly. This shows that the self is not a fixed core that merely expresses itself through the brain. It is the pattern of activity in the brain itself, unfolding over time. Seeing the self as a biological construction also helps explain why personal change is possible. Habits can be reshaped, emotional reactions can be retrained, and identities can evolve. Practices such as therapy, meditation, and deliberate learning work not by appealing to a static inner essence, but by gradually changing the neural patterns that generate thoughts, emotions, and self-related beliefs. Over time, these changes alter how the brain constructs the self, which is why people can genuinely become more resilient, more compassionate, or more confident, even though it may feel as if an unchanging me is simply learning new tricks. This perspective also softens the boundaries between people. If each person's sense of self is a construction shaped by biology, development, and social context, then individuality is real, but not absolute. We are not isolated mental islands carrying private, unchangeable cores. We are living processes that have been molded by families, cultures, languages, and shared histories. Our identities overlap, influence each other, and continue to evolve as we interact. The self becomes less of a private possession and more of a dynamic pattern that exists in constant relationship with the world around it. Perhaps most importantly, understanding the self as a biological construction invites a more compassionate view of both ourselves and others. It allows us to see that many struggles with identity, confidence, emotional regulation, and behavior are not failures of character, but difficulties in the neural processes that generate a stable and adaptive sense of self. It suggests that growth is not about uncovering some hidden, perfect version of who we really are, but about reshaping the biological patterns that are continually making us who we feel ourselves to be. The idea that perception is a controlled hallucination guided by prediction and survival reframes the way we understand our relationship with reality. We are used to thinking of perception as a passive process, as though our eyes, ears, and skin simply record what is out there, and then send that information into the brain, where it becomes our experience of the world. This view feels intuitive because the world appears so solid, so stable, and so undeniably real. Yet neuroscience suggests that what we experience is not a direct copy of the external environment, but an active construction, one that the brain continuously generates in order to keep the body alive and functioning in an uncertain world. Your brain is constantly making predictions about what it is likely to encounter next. It does this because sensory information is incomplete, noisy, and often ambiguous. Light reaching your eyes can vary dramatically depending on shadows, reflections, and weather conditions. Sounds can overlap, echo, or be distorted by distance. Touch can be vague and fleeting. If your brain waited passively for perfect sensory data before deciding what was happening, you would be slow, confused, and vulnerable. Instead, it uses prior experience to form expectations about what should be there and then checks incoming sensory signals against those expectations. What you consciously experience is the brain's best current guess about the causes of those signals. This process is sometimes described as perception being a controlled hallucination. The word hallucination here does not mean something random or pathological, but rather something generated by the brain itself. The control comes from sensory input and from the brain's internal models, which constrain and shape what is being generated. You are not simply seeing the world. You are experiencing a model of the world that your brain has constructed, one that is constantly being updated to minimize surprise and maximize your chances of staying alive. A simple example of this can be found in visual illusions. In certain illusions, two shapes that are physically identical can appear to be different sizes, colors, or brightness levels depending on their context. Your brain is not making a careless mistake. It is applying assumptions that usually serve you well, such as the idea that light typically comes from above, or that objects farther away are usually smaller. These assumptions are part of the predictive machinery that allows you to navigate the world efficiently. In unusual laboratory conditions, they can lead to striking misperceptions, revealing the hidden rules your brain normally uses to construct your visual reality. This predictive, survival-oriented construction extends far beyond vision. Your perception of sound, touch, taste, and even time is shaped by what your brain expects to happen. If you anticipate a loud noise, it often feels less startling when it arrives. If you expect pain, the pain can feel more intense. If you believe a drink will taste sweet, it often does, even when the chemical composition is unchanged. These effects are not mere tricks of imagination. They reflect the way your brain's predictions are woven directly into the fabric of conscious experience. Crucially, these predictions are guided by what has historically helped your species survive. Your brain is not primarily interested in showing you an objective picture of the world. It is interested in keeping you alive long enough to reproduce. This means it prioritizes detecting threats, recognizing opportunities, and maintaining the body's internal balance. Your perception is therefore tuned to what matters biologically. You are more sensitive to sudden movements, sharp sounds, and signs of danger than to subtle, irrelevant changes in your environment. Your conscious world is shaped around survival significance, not around philosophical accuracy. This survival-driven modeling also applies to how you perceive your own body. The feeling of having a body, of being located inside it, and of controlling it is part of the same predictive process. Your brain predicts the sensory consequences of your own movements and compares them to what actually happens. When these predictions match, you feel a sense of agency and ownership. When they do not, you can feel as if your body is not quite yours, or that your actions are being influenced by something external. These strange experiences, which can occur in certain neurological and psychiatric conditions, again show that even your sense of being an embodied self is something your brain is actively generating. Understanding perception as a controlled hallucination also helps explain why different people can experience the same situation in radically different ways. Two individuals can hear the same words, witness the same event, or feel the same physical sensation, yet interpret and experience it differently. Their brains are using different prior experiences, emotional states, and expectations to construct their personal models of what is happening. What feels like an objective disagreement about what really happened can often be traced back to differences in the internal models that their brains are using to generate conscious experience. This perspective does not mean that reality does not exist or that everything is merely an illusion. There is a real world out there, and your brain is continuously trying to track it. The point is that you do not experience that world directly. You experience a best guess, a living simulation that is constantly being refined. Most of the time, this simulation is accurate enough to guide effective action. You avoid obstacles, recognize faces, understand speech, and find food because your brain's model aligns well with the structure of the environment. But the alignment is always approximate, and it can be biased by your history, your emotions, and your biological priorities. Perhaps the most profound implication of this idea is that your lived reality is not a neutral stage on which your life plays out. It is part of you. It is something your brain is actively making, shaped by your body, your past, your fears, and your needs. The world you experience is, in a very real sense, your brain's version of the world, optimized not for philosophical truth, but for survival, meaning, and action. The idea that identity emerges from neural processes rather than from an external essence reshapes how we understand what it means to be a person. Many cultural, philosophical, and religious traditions have long suggested that who we are is anchored in something beyond the physical body, whether described as a soul, a spirit, or an immaterial self that simply inhabits the brain. This belief feels intuitively right because our inner life seems so vivid, private, and continuous that it does not appear to be the product of biological machinery. Yet evidence from neuroscience increasingly points to a different conclusion: the traits, values, memories, emotions, and personal narratives that make you feel like you are not expressions of a hidden essence, but patterns of activity that arise from how your brain is organized and how it interacts with your body and environment. From the moment you are born, your brain begins to change in response to experience. Neural connections are strengthened, weakened, pruned, and rewired depending on what you encounter, what you learn, and what you repeatedly do. Language, social norms, emotional habits, and ways of interpreting the world are gradually inscribed into neural circuits. Over time, these circuits form stable tendencies that shape how you think, feel, and behave. Your preferences, fears, moral intuitions, and sense of humor are not simply uncovered from some pre-existing core. They are constructed through this continuous sculpting of neural pathways. Memory plays a central role in this emergence of identity. You experience yourself as the same person over time because your brain maintains and updates a network of memories that link your present to your past. Yet these memories are not static recordings. Each time you recall an event, your brain reconstructs it, blending stored fragments with your current beliefs and emotional state. This means that your personal history is being subtly rewritten as you live it. Your identity, which depends heavily on your remembered past, is therefore not anchored to a fixed record, but to a living, changing neural narrative. Emotion is another foundational layer. The way you tend to respond emotionally to situations is deeply shaped by brain systems that regulate fear, reward, attachment, and motivation. Some people feel easily threatened, others feel naturally optimistic, some are drawn to novelty, and others prefer stability. These emotional tendencies influence which experiences stand out to you, which memories become salient, and which goals feel meaningful. Over time, they help shape the kind of person you believe yourself to be. Yet these tendencies can be altered by changes in brain chemistry, life events, or therapeutic intervention, showing again that identity is not fixed in an external essence, but grounded in biological processes that can shift. The influence of neural processes on identity becomes particularly clear in cases of brain injury and neurological disease. Damage to specific brain regions can change personality, impulse control, empathy, moral judgment, and even basic preferences. A person who was once gentle can become aggressive. Someone who was cautious can become impulsive. Loved ones may say that the person is not the same anymore. And in a very real sense, they are right. When the neural systems that generate patterns of thought and emotion are altered, the person's identity changes. There is no untouched inner core that remains exactly the same while only the expression changes. The change is in the very processes that constitute the person's experience of being who they are. This neural grounding of identity also explains why cultural and social environments have such a powerful influence on who we become. Language shapes how we categorize the world and ourselves. Social norms influence what we feel proud of, ashamed of, or responsible for. Repeated exposure to certain narratives, values, and expectations becomes wired into neural circuits that guide perception and behavior. Over time, the brain internalizes these patterns and they become experienced as personal beliefs and traits rather than as learned influences. What feels like an inner essence is often the result of deeply ingrained neural adaptations to a particular cultural and social environment. Understanding identity as emerging from neural processes does not mean that individuality is an illusion. Each brain develops along a unique path shaped by genetics, early experiences, and chance events. No two brains are wired in exactly the same way, which is why no two personal identities are identical. Individuality is real, but it is embodied. It exists as a particular pattern of biological organization, rather than as a separate metaphysical substance. This perspective grounds uniqueness in physical reality while still honoring the richness and depth of personal experience. This view also reframes personal growth and change. If identity were anchored in a fixed external essence, meaningful change would be limited. You could only express what was already there. But if identity emerges from neural processes, then change is not only possible but expected. Learning new skills, forming new relationships, overcoming fears, and reshaping habits all involve altering neural patterns. Over time, these changes accumulate and transform how you experience yourself. You do not merely add new layers to an unchanging core. You become, in a very literal sense, a different version of yourself. Perhaps most importantly, this understanding invites a more compassionate and realistic view of human differences and struggles. If identity is the product of neural processes shaped by biology, development, and environment, then differences in behavior, emotional regulation, and self-concept are not simply matters of character or willpower. They reflect variations in the underlying systems that generate experience. This does not remove personal responsibility, but it situates it within a framework that acknowledges the powerful influence of biology and history. It encourages approaches to education, mental health, and social policy that focus not on blaming an imagined inner essence, but on supporting and reshaping the conditions that shape the neural processes from which identity emerges. Understanding consciousness changes how we understand responsibility, meaning, and reality because it forces us to confront the fact that our inner life is not a transparent window onto the world, nor the expression of an untouchable inner core, but a biological process that shapes every thought, decision, and value we hold. Most people grow up assuming that their choices arise from a stable, central self that stands apart from the brain, observing thoughts and selecting actions in a detached way. This assumption quietly supports many of our ideas about blame, praise, purpose, and truth. When consciousness is seen instead as something the brain actively constructs, these familiar ideas do not vanish, but they are transformed in subtle and important ways. Responsibility, for instance, begins to look less like the command of an independent inner agent and more like the outcome of interacting biological, psychological, and social systems. Your brain generates impulses, emotional reactions, moral intuitions, and long-term plans based on a combination of genetic predispositions, past experiences, cultural learning, and current bodily states. When you make a decision, what you experience as a deliberate choice is the conscious expression of processes that have already been shaped by these factors. This does not mean that people are mere machines acting without accountability. It means that accountability must be understood in light of how decisions actually arise. Instead of treating responsibility as the property of a mysterious inner self, it can be grounded in how neural systems respond to incentives, consequences, learning, and social expectations, this shift has practical implications. Punishment, for example, can be reconsidered not simply as retribution against a freely choosing inner agent, but as a tool for shaping future behavior by influencing the biological and social processes that generate choices. Education, therapy, and rehabilitation can be seen as ways of reshaping neural patterns so that people become more capable of making decisions that benefit both themselves and others. Responsibility remains meaningful, but it becomes connected to the conditions that shape conscious experience rather than to an abstract notion of a detached will. Meaning is also transformed by this understanding. Many people search for meaning as though it was something waiting to be discovered, written into the universe or into their own essence. Yet if consciousness is something the brain creates, then meaning is not found in the world in the same way that mountains or stars are found. Meaning is something that emerges from how your brain evaluates experiences in terms of value, relevance, and purpose. What feels meaningful to you is what your neural systems have learned to care about. Relationships, achievements, creative expression, and moral ideals matter because your brain has come to represent them as significant for your well-being, your identity, and your place in a social world. This does not make meaning shallow or arbitrary. On the contrary, it explains why meaning feels so deeply personal and emotionally powerful. It is rooted in neural systems that regulate motivation, attachment, and reward. When you feel that something gives your life purpose, you are experiencing the output of biological processes that have been tuned by evolution to support survival, bonding, and cooperation. Meaning is therefore not an illusion, but it is also not an external property waiting to be uncovered. It is a lived reality generated within conscious experience itself. Our understanding of reality also changes. If perception is an active construction rather than a passive recording, then the reality you experience is not simply the world as it is, but the world as modeled by your brain. This means that your conscious reality is always a blend of what is out there and how your brain predicts, interprets, and values it. Two people can live in the same physical environment and yet inhabit very different experienced worlds. Their fears, hopes, beliefs, and memories shape what they notice, what they ignore, and how they interpret events. Reality, as lived, is therefore deeply personal, even though it is anchored in a shared physical world. This perspective invites humility about our own certainty. When you recognize that your experience is a model constructed by your brain, it becomes harder to assume that your view of the world is the only possible or correct one. Disagreements are no longer just clashes between right and wrong interpretations of an obvious reality. They can also be understood as differences between the internal models that different brains are using to make sense of the same underlying world. This does not mean that all views are equally valid, but it encourages openness to the idea that your own experience is one version among many. At the same time, this understanding deepens empathy. If everyone's conscious reality is shaped by their neural history, emotional patterns, and social context, then other people's reactions, beliefs, and struggles become more intelligible. Instead of seeing them solely as personal choices made by a detached inner self, they can be seen as the outcomes of complex biological and experiential processes. This can soften harsh judgments and support approaches to social conflict, mental health, and education that focus on understanding and reshaping the conditions that shape conscious experience. Perhaps most profoundly, seeing consciousness as an active biological construction reframes what it means to exist at all. Your sense of being someone, of having a life that matters, of standing in relation to a meaningful world, is not guaranteed by some hidden metaphysical substance. It is something that your brain is doing right now, continuously, to sustain a coherent experience of reality and self. This makes existence feel both more fragile and more precious. The world, the person you believe yourself to be, and the meanings you hold dear are all part of a living process that can change, adapt, and sometimes fail. They are not etched into the fabric of the universe, but they are no less real for being made. They are real because they are lived, felt, and enacted within the conscious experience that your brain creates moment by moment.